The coronation chamber filled with silence so thick it pressed against Garrett's chest like a physical weight. He stood among the diplomatic observers, watching the Velestron nobles turn their backs one by one on the figure kneeling at the center of the obsidian platform. Queen Solara remained motionless, her crystalline skin refracting the chamber's amber light into fractured patterns across the floor. The crown of her mother lay 3 steps above her on the throne of ascendance, untouched, waiting for someone to place it upon her head. No one moved. Garrett had been on Velastra Prime for 6 months as part of Earth's new cultural exchange program. He'd studied their customs, learned their language, understood that the coronation ritual required a noble to kneel before the heir and pledge their house before the crown could be transferred. What he hadn't understood until this moment was that tradition also allowed for collective rejection. The 53 noble houses of Velastra had spent 3 days standing in this chamber, and not one had knelt. The Velestron to his left, Ambassador Threxel, leaned close. His 4 eyes blinked in sequence. A gesture Garrett had learned meant extreme discomfort. "They will let her die there," Threxel whispered. "Protocol states she cannot rise until accepted or until her heart stop. It has been 70 hours. How long can she survive? Perhaps another day? Perhaps less." Threxel's mandibles clicked softly. "They reject her because her mother married beneath station, because Solara's father was a commoner who died defending the palace, because tradition matters more than reason." The nearest noble, Lord Carvesh of House Mordian, stood with his arms crossed, his expression carved from contempt. His ceremonial armor gleamed, covered in honors he'd inherited, not earned. Behind him, the other nobles maintained their vigil of cruelty, some seated, some standing, all watching the queen who could not be slowly dying. Garrett felt something shift inside him, a hot wire of anger that started in his gut and spread through his limbs. He'd grown up on stories of Earth's bloody path to democracy, of people who'd fought systems designed to crush them. He'd joined the diplomatic corps because he believed civilizations could learn from each other, could build bridges across the void between stars. But standing here, watching nobility murder a woman through procedural sadism, he realized some bridges needed to be burned. He stepped forward. Threxel grabbed his arm. "Human, no. You have no standing. You are not Velestron. This is not your world." "Neither is it theirs alone," Garrett said quietly, pulling free. "They're choosing to let her die. I'm choosing differently." The walk across that polished floor felt longer than his journey from Earth. Each step echoed in the silence. The nobles noticed him immediately. Whispers spread like ripples on water. Lord Carvesh's expression shifted from contempt to confusion to outrage as Garrett approached the platform. Garrett had studied the ritual. He knew the words, the gestures, the weight of what he was about to do. He also knew it might mean nothing. A human had no house to pledge, no lineage recognized by Velestron law, no legitimate claim to participate in their traditions. But he'd learned something else in his months here. Velestron law was built on precedent, and sometimes precedent needed to be shattered. He climbed the 3 steps to where Solara knelt. Up close he could see the tremors running through her body, the way her crystalline skin had dimmed from its usual luminescence to a cloudy gray. Her eyes, triple-pupilled in gold, tracked him with the last reserves of her awareness. Garrett knelt. The chamber erupted in voices. Nobles shouted in 4 different Velestron dialects, their translator devices creating a cacophony of protest. Lord Carvesh's voice cut through the noise. "This is blasphemy. Remove this alien. He defiles our most sacred tradition." Garrett ignored them. He placed his right hand over his heart and his left hand palm up before Solara, exactly as the ritual demanded. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and clear in perfect high Velestron. "I am Garrett Shen of House Terra, son of Mai and David, servant of Earth's united peoples. I kneel before Solara, daughter of Queen Velthara and Commander Jackson, rightful heir to the throne of Ascendance. I pledge my honor, my strength, and my loyalty to your reign. I recognize you as queen, now and always, until the stars go dark." Her hand, trembling, reached toward his outstretched palm. Lord Carvesh was climbing the platform now, rage twisting his features. "She cannot accept. The ritual requires a noble of Velastra. A recognized house. This human has neither." In those alien eyes he saw intelligence, pain, determination, and something else. A question. She was asking him if he understood what this meant, the chaos he was unleashing, the price they might both pay. He nodded once. Her crystalline fingers touched his palm. The contact sent a shock through the chamber, not physical but psychic, a pulse that every Velestron felt. Their species had evolved with limited telepathic sensitivity, enough to recognize genuine pledges from false ones. The touch between supplicant and heir was meant to reveal truth. Garrett felt it too, not as thought or emotion, but as pure certainty. He understood in that instant why Solara's mother had married a commoner, why some traditions deserved to crumble, why humanity had fought so hard to leave behind the chains of inherited power. He felt Solara's exhaustion, her grief for her mother, her fury at the nobles who'd rather see the throne empty than accept her. He felt her recognition of him, not as alien or inferior, but as someone who understood what it meant to stand against a system designed to break you. Solara's other hand reached up and took the crown from its resting place. The chamber fell silent again, all protests dying as she lifted it high. Her voice, weak but unbroken, rang out in formal declaration. I accept the pledge of Garrett Chen of House Terra. I name him first consul of the Velistran throne. I claim my mother's crown and my people's future. She placed the crown upon her own head. According to tradition, the noble who pledged was meant to perform this act, but Solara was already rewriting rules. The crown settled into place and light blazed from it. From her, a response to recognized authority that couldn't be faked or forced. Queen Solara stood. Garrett rose with her. Lord Karvesh's hand went to his ceremonial blade. A dozen other nobles mirrored the gesture. The chamber balanced on the edge of violence. Solara raised one hand. You have made your choice, Lord Karvesh. So have I. Any who draw weapons in the sacred space forfeit their house and holdings. Velistran law is clear on this matter. Test me if you wish. The Lord's hand froze. He was many things, but not stupid. Around the chamber, nobles began to calculate. Some still burned with outrage, but others were already seeing new possibilities, new alliances, new paths to power that didn't require murdering their queen. Ambassador Threxel approached slowly, his 4 eyes wide. Your Majesty, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. The Velistran Council of Worlds recognizes your coronation. We pledge the loyalty of the outer settlements. It was a political masterstroke. Threxel commanded the allegiance of 40 colony worlds, nearly a third of Velistran territory. Other nobles would have to choose now, support their new queen, or face civil war against the colonies and whoever else rallied to her banner. Lord Karvesh's face went through a series of expressions before settling on cold acceptance. He didn't kneel, he didn't pledge, but he stepped back and his hand left his blade. It was enough, for now. Solara looked at Garrett, and for the first time since he'd entered the chamber, she smiled. It transformed her face, made her alien features suddenly, startlingly beautiful. First Consul Chen, we have much work to do. Walk with me. She descended from the platform, and Garrett walked at her side. Very aware of the eyes tracking them, very aware that he'd just become the most controversial figure in Velistran politics. He'd come to this world to observe, to learn, to build understanding. Instead, he'd knelt before an alien queen and changed the course of her civilization. He should probably feel terrified. Instead, as they left the chamber and the whispers exploded behind them, he felt more alive than he'd ever been. The real challenge, he suspected, was just beginning. The royal apartments overlooked Velastra Prime's capital city, a sprawl of crystalline towers that caught the binary star's light and scattered it in prismatic displays. Solara stood at the window, still wearing her crown, her posture rigid. Medical attendants had tried to approach her 3 times. She'd dismissed them all. You should let them examine you, Garrett said. 70 hours without food or water. I know my body's limits, Consul. She turned from the window. What I don't know is why a human diplomat destroyed his career to save someone he'd never met. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the reality of what he'd done. Earth's diplomatic corps would be receiving reports within the hour. His superiors would demand explanations he couldn't quite articulate. Your mother's funeral was the first state event I attended on Velastra. I watched you stand at her pyre for 8 hours without shedding a tear, because your culture considers public grief weakness. I saw how the nobles circled you even then, vultures waiting for their chance. And I thought about Earth's history, all the times good people died because everyone else was too afraid or too invested in the system to act. So you acted. Solara moved closer, destroying precedent, violating protocol, making yourself an enemy of half the noble houses. For what, Principal? For you, Garrett said simply. Because watching you die would have made me complicit. Because some things are worth the consequences. The Queen studied him with those triple-pupiled eyes. You don't understand what you've become. do you? First Consul isn't an honorary title, it's a position that hasn't existed in 600 years, not since the Unification Wars. It grants you authority over the throne's military forces, the right to sit in judgment on noble disputes, and a voice in succession should I die without an heir. You have more legal power than any non-royal in Velestron history. Garrett felt the blood drain from his face. I just thought it was a formal acknowledgement of the pledge. No. Solara's smile was sharp now. It was my very deliberate choice. The nobles rejected me because they thought I was weak, because my father had no house name, because they believed they could control or eliminate me. By accepting your pledge and granting you that title, I sent a message. I will find strength wherever it exists. Tradition be damned. I will build power from whatever foundation supports me, and I will not be caged by their expectations. The door slid open before either could respond. A young Velestron in military armor entered, saluted sharply. Your Majesty, First Consul. The Noble Assembly has requested an emergency session. They're demanding the Consul's pledge be nullified on grounds of species incompatibility with Velestron law. Of course they are. Silara's hand drifted to a panel on the wall, calling up a holographic display of the palace. Red markers indicated Noble House representatives gathering in the assembly hall. Captain Vex, what's the military's position? The captain's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. Divided, Majesty. The older generals remember your mother's strength. The younger officers see opportunity and change. But there's fear. Fear of civil war, fear of off-world intervention, fear of what comes next. Fear is useful, Solara said. It means they're paying attention. Garrett, you're about to face your first trial as First Consul. The Assembly will attempt to dismantle your position through legal argument. Are you prepared? I don't know Velestron law well enough to. You won't need to. Solara turned back to the window. I'll handle the law. What I need from you is something else. When they question your right to stand with me, when they cite 1,000 years of precedent, when they call you inferior, lesser, alien, I need you to remember why you knelt. Because that certainty, that core of moral clarity, is the only weapon they can't counter with tradition. The walk to the assembly hall took 15 minutes. Word had spread. Palace staff stopped to watch them pass. Some bowed to Solara, others stared at Garrett with open hostility. By the time they reached the great doors, Garrett's heart was hammering against his ribs. The assembly hall was designed to intimidate. 53 noble houses, each with their own platform rising in tiers around a central floor. At the highest level sat the 7 High Lords, the most powerful nobles in Velestron space. Lord Karvesh occupied the center position, and his expression promised blood. Solara entered first. Garrett followed 3 steps behind, as protocol demanded. Every eye tracked them as they crossed to the throne platform at the hall's focal point. Solara sat. Garrett stood to her right, the First Consul's traditional position. Lord Karvesh rose. This assembly is called to order under emergency protocols. We address a matter of fundamental law, the validity of an alien's pledge to the throne of ascendance. I propose immediate nullification and the Consul's deportation to his homeworld. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the tiers. Garrett counted quickly. At least 30 houses nodding support. His diplomatic training screamed warnings. This was a trap. They'd had hours to prepare arguments, to build coalition, to plan their assault. Solara had minutes, but the Queen looked almost bored. Lord Karvesh, your proposal requires a majority vote from the Assembly. Before we proceed, I have a question. Have you reviewed the Ascension protocols in their entirety? Karvesh's expression flickered. Of course, Your Majesty. The protocols are clear. Only a noble of recognized Velestron lineage may... Chapter 3, verse 17 states that coronation requires the pledge of a recognized noble house. Correct. Solara stood. And what does Chapter 8, verse 9 state regarding the First Consul's appointment? Silence. Karvesh's mandibles clicked in irritation. That is, an archaic provision. It hasn't been invoked in 643 years, yes, but it remains law. Chapter 8, verse 9. The sovereign may appoint a First Consul from any who kneel in genuine pledge, regardless of origin, if the sovereign's judgment deems such appointment necessary for the realm's survival. The only requirements are genuine pledge and sovereign necessity. My judgment determined both conditions were met. Do you challenge my judgment, Lord Karvesh? The trap had reversed. Challenging a sovereign's judgment on matters of necessity was grounds for treason. Karvesh sat down slowly. Another noble rose, this one from the 3rd tier, Lady Mirith of House Crystalline. Your Majesty, perhaps the pledge was genuine, but how can a human understand our ways well enough to serve as consul? How can he judge disputes between houses when he knows nothing of our history, our honor codes, He knows that 53 houses were willing to let me die rather than accept my mother's choice of husband. He knows that nobility in this assembly means inherited privilege defended by procedural cruelty. He knows that honor, as you define it, is worth less than a single act of courage from an outsider. Shall I continue, Lady Myreth? Or would you prefer I don't elaborate on what the first consul knows? Myreth sat down. A third noble rose, Lord Sethix, ancient and cunning. Your Majesty shows great spirit, but spirits break against reality. The reality is this. The noble houses control 70% of this empire's military forces, 80% of its economic production, and 90% of its administrative apparatus. If we collectively refuse to recognize your first consul, he has no power. If we refuse to recognize your reign, you have no throne. We can walk out of this chamber right now and leave you with a crown and nothing else. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Garrett saw Solara's hand tighten on her throne's arm, the only sign she'd felt the blow. This was the real attack. Not legal argument, but naked power. They were offering her a choice, dismiss him or face rebellion. Garrett stepped forward. He didn't ask permission, didn't check with Solara. He simply moved to the center of the chamber floor and spoke. Lord Sethix is right. Solara's eyes widened fractionally. Garrett continued. You do control the military. You do control the economy.
You do control the administration. And if you walk out right now, the Queen will have nothing but a crown.
He paused. But I want to tell you a story about Earth. We don't need Karvesh started. 200 years ago, Garrett said, voice rising to cut through the interruption, Earth's governments were controlled by people like you. Rich, powerful, convinced their status made them superior. They owned everything. They controlled everyone. And they thought they were untouchable. Do you know what happened to them? They fell. Not all at once. Not easily. But they fell because they forgot a fundamental truth. Power that rests on nothing but inheritance is the weakest power in the universe. It has no legitimacy beyond tradition. It inspires no loyalty beyond fear. And when enough people stop believing in it, it evaporates like morning frost. Insolent! Someone shouted from the upper tiers. I'm not finished. Garrett's voice hardened. You want to know what I understand about Velestron culture? I understand that you're terrified. Not of me. Not even of the Queen. You're terrified that she represents something you can't control. The possibility that power could be earned instead of inherited. That's why you let her kneel for 70 hours. That's why you're trying to nullify my position. Because if a queen can be crowned with the pledge of a common human, what does that say about your noble blood? What does that say about your inherited rights? What does that say about whether you deserve anything you have? Lord Sethix stood slowly. You dare lecture us on... I dare tell you the truth, Garrett said. And here it is. You can walk out of this chamber. You can refuse to recognize us. You can start your civil war. But know this, the outer colonies will support the Queen. Earth's diplomatic network will support the Queen. And every common Velestron who's spent their life bowing to nobles who've done nothing to earn respect will support the Queen. You control 70% of the military? Ask yourselves how many soldiers will follow you when you're openly rebelling against a crowned sovereign. You control the economy? Ask yourselves how long that lasts when trade routes close and colonies stop sending resources. You think you're untouchable because you've always been untouchable, but empires built on nothing but tradition collapse the moment someone stands up and says no more. I'm saying it. The Queen is saying it. How many others do you think are ready to say it with us? The chamber had gone absolutely silent. Garrett felt sweat running down his back, felt the weight of hundreds of alien eyes. He'd just committed himself completely, burned every bridge, made himself the focal point of a revolution he'd stumbled into. But he wasn't done. You want to test us? Go ahead. Walk out. We'll see who still stands when the dust settles. But if you want to avoid bloodshed, if you want to avoid tearing this empire apart, then sit down. Accept that things have changed.
Accept that your queen has vision beyond maintaining your privilege.
And accept that the first consul you're so eager to dismiss might be exactly what this empire needs. Someone who owes nothing to your system and everything to the principles that actually matter. The silence stretched. Garrett waited, heart pounding, knowing he'd either just saved Solara's reign or guaranteed its violent end. Lord Sethix remained standing. His ancient face was unreadable. Then slowly he looked around the assembly, meeting the eyes of the other High Lords, of the noble houses arrayed in their tiers. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. A human speaks uncomfortable truths. I remember the last civil war. I remember what it cost us. Millions dead. Whole worlds burned. And for what? To determine which noble house would hold precedence over which others. To protect tradition that was already dying. He paused. I am old. I have seen much. And I will not spend my final years watching my civilization devour itself over a human's pledge and a queen's choice of consul. Not to Garrett, not even directly to Solara, but to the idea they represented. That maybe, just maybe, change was possible without apocalypse. Other nobles rose. Not all. Not even half, but enough. Lady Mirith knelt. Captain Vex, representing the military, knelt. Ambassador Threxel, who'd already committed to Solara's cause, knelt again. The assembly fractured before Garrett's eyes into three groups: those who knelt, those who stood in uncertain neutrality, and a core of perhaps 15 houses who remained defiantly seated, Carvache among them. Solara descended from her throne. She walked to Lord Sethix first, placed her hand on his shoulder in the traditional gesture of acceptance, then to each noble who had knelt, one by one, acknowledging their pledge personally. It took nearly an hour. Garrett waited, still standing in the chamber's center, very aware of the nobles who hadn't knelt, watching him with barely concealed hatred. When Solara finished, she returned to the center, to Garrett. And she did something he didn't expect. She knelt before him, not in pledge, but in partnership, bringing herself to his level. First Consul Garrett Chen, do you accept the responsibility of your position? Do you understand that you are now bound to Valestra's fate as surely as I am? Do you pledge to serve not tradition, not comfort, not safety, but the survival and evolution of this empire, no matter the cost? Garrett looked down at his queen, this alien woman who had survived 3 days of political torture and emerged ready to fight. On my honor, on Earth's name, on every principle I hold sacred, I do... Then we begin. Solara stood, and Garrett stood with her. This assembly is adjourned. All houses have 48 hours to declare their final positions. Support, opposition, or neutrality. Choose honestly. The time for games is over. She turned and walked from the chamber, Garrett at her side. Behind them, the assembly erupted in argument. Some were already fleeing to make arrangements, to contact their houses, to prepare for whatever came next. Others clustered around Carvache, and Garrett knew those would be the core of opposition, the nobles who would never accept change. Outside the assembly hall, Solara finally allowed herself to show exhaustion. She leaned against the wall, crown still perfect on her head, but body trembling. That was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever witnessed, Consul. Did it work? We won't know for 48 hours, but you gave them something to think about besides their wounded pride. You made them see the cliff we're all standing on. She looked at him. You also made yourself a target. Carvache won't forgive this. Neither will the other hardliners. They'll come for you, one way or another. Let them. You say that now. Wait until you're facing assassination attempts, political traps, and character assassination. Solara pushed off the wall. Come, we have work to do. If we're going to survive the next 48 hours, we need allies beyond the assembly. We need the people. The people? Common Velestrans, the billions who've watched noble houses play power games with their lives. You spoke to the assembly about Earth's revolution. Now show me how to inspire one of our own. But carefully, Consul. We need change, not chaos. We need evolution, not civil war. They walked through the palace corridors, and Garrett realized the weight of what he'd taken on. He wasn't just first consul in title. He was now the face of transformation, the symbol of possibility, the human who'd knelt when nobles wouldn't. Somewhere on Earth, his superiors were probably having collective heart attacks. Somewhere on this world, Carvache was planning revenge. And somewhere in the city below, common Velestrans were hearing about what happened in the assembly hall, about a human who'd stood against the nobility and lived. Garrett had come to Velestran to observe. Instead, he'd become the catalyst for something vast and dangerous and necessary. And as he walked beside his queen through the twilight of a civilization on the edge of metamorphosis, he felt the weight of every choice that had led him here. The stars outside the palace windows blazed in their binary dance, and Garrett wondered if they were watching this moment, if somewhere in the cosmic dark, other civilizations were learning that sometimes the most profound changes came from the simplest acts, a knee bending, a hand extended, a voice saying yes when everyone else chose no. The revolution had begun, not with weapons or armies, but with a human's pledge and an alien queen's acceptance. Now they had to survive it. The common districts of Velastra's capital had never seen a reigning monarch walk their streets. Sylar had changed that on the first day after the assembly confrontation. She dismissed her security detail except for Captain Vex and insisted Garrett accompany her. The crowds that gathered were initially silent, uncertain how to react to their queen appearing without ceremony or distance. Then a child broke through the cordon, a young Velastran girl, maybe 6 in human years, and ran directly to Solara. Garrett tensed. Vex's hand went to her weapon, but Sylara knelt, bringing herself eye level with the child. "Your Majesty," the girl said in the careful high Velastron taught in public schools. "Is it true a human saved you?" Solara glanced at Garrett, then back to the child. "He didn't save me. He stood with me when others wouldn't. There's a difference. My teacher says humans are weak, that they can't even breathe our air without help." The child looked at Garrett with open curiosity. "Is she wrong?" Garrett stepped closer, felt the weight of hundreds of eyes. "Your teacher is right about the breathing. Wrong about the weakness. Humans can't survive on Velastra without respiratory assists. But strength isn't just about biology. It's about choice. It's about what you do when everything tells you to walk away." The child considered this. "My father is a factory worker. The noble who owns the factory cut his pay again. Father says we can't eat and pay housing both. He says it's not fair, but there's nothing he can do." "Is he weak?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Garrett felt the crowd's attention sharpen, felt the moment's danger. This wasn't abstract politics anymore. This was the reality of Velastron society laid bare by a child's honesty. Solara spoke before Garrett could. "Your father is not weak. He's trapped in a system that mistakes cruelty for strength. Tell me your name, child." "Lyra, Majesty." "Lyra, I need you to give your father a message. Tell him the Queen remembers what it's like to be powerless. Tell him change is coming. Tell him to hold on a little longer." Solara stood, addressing the crowd now. "I know many of you have watched noble houses grow rich while you grow hungry. I know you've seen justice applied differently to those with titles and those without. I know you've been told this is the natural order, that tradition demands acceptance. But I am your queen, and I am done accepting systems that crush those they should protect." A voice from the crowd, male and rough. "Pretty words, Majesty, but words don't feed families. Words don't change laws that favor nobles. What are you actually going to do?" Garrett saw Solara's posture shift, saw her make a decision. "Walk with me. All of you who want answers, walk with me to the palace. Let's discuss exactly what I'm going to do." It started with maybe 50 people. By the time they reached the palace, the crowd had swollen to thousands. Palace guards looked panicked, uncertain whether this was a march or a mob. Solara led them through the main gates, into the public courtyard, and up onto the announcement platform where monarchs traditionally addressed their subjects during festivals. Garrett stood beside her, watching the sea of crystalline faces, each one reflecting light in unique patterns. These were the people the nobles dismissed as irrelevant, as background noise to their political games. But Garrett saw something else. Potential. Unity. The possibility of transformation if someone could just give them direction without manipulation. Solara raised her hands for quiet. The crowd stilled. "For 600 years, the noble houses have controlled Velastron society through tradition and law. They own the factories, the farms, the transport networks, the resources. They set wages, prices, working conditions. And if you object, if you organize, if you demand change, they have legal authority to dismiss you, blacklist you, sometimes imprison you. All perfectly legal under current law. All perfectly traditional." Mutters of agreement rippled through the crowd. "But here's what tradition doesn't tell you," Solara continued. "Those laws weren't divine gifts. They were written by nobles for nobles to protect noble interests. They can be changed. They will be changed. My first act as queen is to announce the Common Rights Initiative, new laws guaranteeing minimum wages, maximum working hours, and worker protections across all Velastron space. Enforcement will be handled by a new agency answering directly to the throne, not to noble houses." The crowd erupted, some in celebration, some in disbelief, some in loud skepticism. A voice cut through. The Assembly will never allow it. The Assembly doesn't have a choice, Solara said. These protections fall under royal prerogative for citizen welfare. The nobles can object, can delay, can resist, but they cannot legally prevent implementation. Of course, they can refuse to follow the new laws. They can challenge me, and if they do, I'll know exactly which houses value their profits over my authority. That will be informative. She was forcing the nobility into a choice: comply and lose some economic power, or rebel and prove they valued money over loyalty to the crown. Either way, she won information about who stood where. An older Velestron, his crystalline skin dimmed with age, pushed to the front. Majesty, this is bold. Perhaps too bold. The last time a monarch tried to limit noble power, it triggered the unification wars. Millions died. Is this worth another war? Is justice worth fighting for? Solara's voice carried across the courtyard. Is dignity worth defending? Are your children's futures worth the risk? I don't want war, but I won't preserve peace by accepting injustice. The nobles will have to decide if their privilege is worth bleeding for. I've already made my choice. The old Velestron studied her, then knelt. Then I stand with you, Majesty. Or kneel, as it were. My grandson works in Lord Karvesh's processing plant. 70 hours a week, paid barely enough to survive. If you're truly going to change this, you have my loyalty. Others knelt. Not everyone. Some in the crowd looked uncertain, fearful of consequences, but enough knelt to make a statement. The Queen had support beyond the nobility, beyond the Assembly, beyond the traditional power structures. Garrett leaned close to Solara. You're moving fast. The nobles will see this as provocation. Good. Let them act rashly. Let them show their true nature before they have time to mask it with false loyalty. She addressed the crowd again. The Common Rights Initiative will be published tonight, but I need something from you in return. I need you to remain peaceful. I need you to trust that change can happen without burning the empire down. Violence will give the nobles exactly the excuse they need to crush this movement and call it law and order. Can you give me that? Can you give me time to do this right? The crowd's agreement was neither unanimous nor enthusiastic, but it was real. Solara had bought herself time, but Garrett knew it was borrowed. If the Common Rights Initiative failed, if the nobles found a way to block it or water it down, these people would lose faith. And angry masses without faith were dangerous. As the crowd dispersed, Captain Vex approached. Her expression was grim. Your Majesty, I'm receiving reports. 3 noble houses have mobilized private military forces. Nothing overt, but their troops are moving to strategic positions around their estates. They're preparing for conflict? Which houses? Solara asked. Karvesh, Mordian, and Crystalline. Garrett recognized those names, the core opposition from the Assembly. They're fortifying? Worse, Vex said. They're positioning to potentially cut off supply lines to the capital. If they coordinate, they could starve the city in a week. Solara's expression hardened. Then we move faster than they expect. Vex, mobilize the Crown Guard. I want the main trade routes secured before dawn. Don't engage unless attacked, but make it clear those routes remain open. If any noble house tries to block them, arrest the commanders and cite emergency authority. That could trigger the war you're trying to avoid, Garrett said. Not acting guarantees it. Karvesh is testing me, seeing if I'll back down when threatened. I need to show him I won't. Solara turned to Vex. Go. Carefully, but go. The captain saluted and left. Garrett and Solara stood alone on the platform, the courtyard now empty. You're walking a razor's edge, Garrett said. I know, but that's where change happens. Too cautious and nothing transforms. Too aggressive and everything collapses. She looked at him. I need you to do something for me, Consul. Something that will either cement your position or destroy you. What? I need you to address the military. The whole military, via Holocast. As First Consul, you have that right. I need you to explain to thousands of Velestron soldiers why they should follow orders from a human. Why they should support a queen who's challenging everything their commanders' noble families represent. Why they should risk their careers and possibly their lives for this transformation. I'm not a military leader. I'm a diplomat. I don't know how to... You told the Assembly that power built on nothing but inheritance was weak. Now prove it. Show the military that leadership isn't about bloodlines. It's about conviction. It's about standing for something beyond yourself. You did it in the coronation chamber. You did it in the Assembly. Now do it for the people who will actually have to fight if this goes wrong. She was right, and Garrett hated that she was right. This was the burden of the position he'd claimed. Not just ceremony and politics, but the hard work of inspiration, of moving people to risk everything for an uncertain future. When? He asked. Now. Before the nobles can spread counter-narratives, before fear takes hold. Right now, while the city is still talking about what happened in that courtyard. They moved to the palace's broadcast center. Technicians scrambled to set up a direct feed to every military installation in Velestron space. Garrett stood before the camera, very aware that hundreds of thousands of soldiers were about to see a human claim authority over them. The light flashed green. He was live. My name is Garrett Chen. I'm human. I'm your first consul. And I know many of you are asking why you should listen to anything I say. He paused, gathering thoughts. I'm not going to pretend I understand Velestron military tradition. I'm not going to claim I've earned your respect through decades of service, but I'm going to tell you what I do understand. The difference between serving power and serving purpose. He thought of Earth's history, of soldiers who'd fought for causes beyond simple orders. 3 days ago, I watched your queen kneel in a coronation chamber for 70 hours while nobles played political games with her life. I watched tradition become torture. I watched power used not to protect but to control. And I made a choice, not as a diplomat, not as a human, but as someone who recognized that some moments demand action regardless of consequences. Garrett leaned closer to the camera. Now your officers are receiving contradictory orders. Some nobles are calling their private forces to defensive positions. Some are questioning the Queen's authority. Some are suggesting that following her commands is disloyalty to tradition. And you're caught in the middle, wondering which orders are legitimate, which cause is just, which side deserves your service. He'd been thinking about this since the assembly confrontation, about what actually moved people to risk everything. Here's my answer. Serve the principle, not the power. Your oath is to Velastra, not to noble houses. Your duty is to protect your civilization, not preserve systems that harm it. Your honor comes from standing for something worth defending, not from blindly following whoever shouts orders loudest. Queen Solara is trying to transform an empire that's been slowly strangling itself with tradition. That transformation will be difficult. It'll be dangerous. It will challenge everything you were taught about hierarchy and authority. But it's necessary, and it's just. I can't order you to follow her. I can only ask you to think about what kind of Velastra you want to serve. One where nobility means inherited privilege defended by force, or one where power has to be earned through service, where justice applies equally to all, where your children might rise based on merit instead of birth. That's the choice, not between the Queen and the nobles. Between the past and the future. First Consul Garrett Chen. Ending transmission. Think about it. Then choose. The technician looked up, his expression unreadable. That's going to cause problems, Consul. Everything worthwhile does, Garrett said. Solara was waiting in her command center, watching feed responses. Reactions are coming in. Some military units are declaring for us immediately. Others are requesting clarification from their noble commanders. A few are threatening mutiny if pushed to choose sides. She pulled up a tactical display. But here's the interesting part. Carvace's forces have stopped advancing. He's paused. Why? You didn't order the military. You asked them to think. That's more dangerous to him than any command. Orders can be countermanded. Thoughts multiply. Solara smiled. You're learning, Consul. An alert flashed on the display. Captain Vex's face appeared on screen. Your Majesty, we've secured the main trade routes. Encountered resistance from House Crystalline forces, but they withdrew when we didn't engage.
No casualties. Routes are open.
Excellent. Hold positions. Avoid provocations, but don't retreat. Solara closed the connection and turned to Garrett. First crisis managed. Now for the second. The Common Rights Initiative. I need the language finalized tonight so it can be published at dawn. That means you and I are about to become legal scholars drafting protection laws for a civilization you barely know. They worked through the night. Garrett quickly learned that Velestran law was a labyrinth of precedent, tradition, and carefully worded loopholes that nobles had spent centuries perfecting. Closing those loopholes without creating new problems required precision he'd never needed in diplomatic work. This clause about minimum wages, he said around midnight. If we set them too high, nobles will claim economic catastrophe and fire workers instead of paying more. Too low, and it's meaningless. So we tie it to living costs? Solara said. Wages must cover housing, food, and basic needs as calculated by regional economic assessments. It's harder to argue against, harder to manipulate. Except nobles control those assessments. Not anymore. The enforcement agency I mentioned. They'll conduct independent assessments, remove noble influence from the process entirely. They refined the language, clause by clause, anticipating objections, plugging gaps. As dawn approached, Garrett felt the exhaustion of 40 hours without sleep pressing down. But Solara showed no signs of stopping, and he wouldn't be the first to surrender. At sunrise, the Common Rights Initiative was published across all Velestron networks. The response was immediate and explosive. Common citizens celebrated. Labor organizations began organizing rallies, and the noble houses erupted in fury. Lord Carvish's response came within the hour, a formal challenge to the initiative's legality, demanding the High Court review the Queen's authority to implement such measures without Assembly approval. Solara read his filing and laughed. He's giving us exactly what we need. A legal battle. Public. Transparent, with the entire Empire watching to see if the court sides with the Queen or the nobles. Perfect. What if the court rules against you? Then we'll know the judiciary is compromised and needs reform too. Either way, we learn the truth about our institutions. That's valuable. She handed Garrett a datapad. Your next task, Consol. The court hearing is in 3 days. You're going to testify as first consul about why these protections serve the Empire's interests. I'm not a lawyer. No, you're something better. Someone who sees clearly because you're not blinded by tradition.
Use that?
Solara stood, finally showing exhaustion. We've bought ourselves 3 days. Use them. Rest. Prepare. Because when we walk into that courtroom, we need to be perfect. The nobles will use every legal trick they have. We counter with truth, clarity, and absolute conviction. Garrett left the command center as the city awakened to its new reality. He walked through corridors where palace staff now looked at him with something between awe and terror. He'd become a symbol, a catalyst, a target, and he had 72 hours to prepare for a legal battle that would determine whether transformation was possible or if the old powers would crush this moment of change. In his quarters, he collapsed onto the bed and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere on Earth, his family was probably seeing news reports about a human diplomat who'd become an alien queen's revolutionary partner. Somewhere in Velestron space, nobles were planning how to destroy him. And somewhere in the city below, people like Lyra and her father were hoping for change they could barely imagine. Garrett closed his eyes and tried to find sleep, but his mind kept returning to Solara's question. Was this worth war? Was justice worth millions of lives? Was transformation worth the risk of collapse? He didn't have answers. But he'd knelt. He'd pledged. And now he'd see it through, whatever the cost, whatever the consequence. The revolution had moved from chambers and streets to courtrooms. And in 3 days, the Empire would learn if law could serve justice or only power. Garrett finally slept. And dreamed of crystalline towers burning while a child asked if her father was weak. The High Court of Velestra occupied a structure older than the current noble houses, built in an architectural style that predated the Unification Wars. Its halls were carved from single pieces of crystal, walls that hummed when struck with specific tones, creating harmonics meant to remind all who entered that truth resonated while lies created discord. Garrett found the symbolism heavy-handed but understood its purpose. This was where Velestron civilization theoretically separated justice from power. Theory and practice he'd learned, rarely aligned. He arrived at the court with Solara 2 hours before the hearing. She insisted on the early arrival. Nobles will position themselves to control optics, she explained. They'll arrive in ceremonial processions, with supporters, making this look like the Queen versus civilization itself. We counter by being here first, calm, prepared, making them look like the agitators. The strategy worked. When the noble houses began arriving, they found Solara and Garrett already seated in the petitioners section, reviewing notes. The contrast was stark. Nobles in elaborate dress, surrounded by advisors and guards, versus a queen and her consul in simple formal attire, alone except for Captain Vex standing watch. Lord Kvash entered last, his procession including representatives from 15 houses. He looked at Garrett with naked contempt before taking his position as primary challenger. Lady Myrith and Lord Sedek sat in the observation section, along with dozens of other nobles whose positions remained unclear. The presiding justice, High Arbiter Thane, entered from a side chamber. He was ancient, his crystalline skin so dimmed with age it appeared almost opaque. His reputation was formidable, incorruptible, traditional, and absolutely committed to legal precedent. Garrett couldn't tell if that would help or harm their cause. Thane struck the harmonic wall, and the courtroom filled with a clear, resonant tone that faded slowly. This court convenes to address House Karvesh's challenge to the Common Rights Initiative. The core question: does the sovereign possess authority to implement labor protections without assembly approval? Lord Karvesh, present your argument. Karvesh stood. His voice was smooth, confident, the sound of someone who'd won before he'd begun. High Arbiter, the law is clear. Economic regulation requires assembly consensus per Chapter 12, Verse 8 of the Governance Codes. The Queen may suggest initiatives, but implementation demands noble approval. This protects the Empire from hasty decisions that could destabilize our economy. The Common Rights Initiative, however well-intentioned, violates this fundamental principle. We ask the court to nullify it and remind Her Majesty that even sovereign power has limits. Direct, clean, built on precedent that had stood for centuries. Garrett watched Solara's expression remain neutral, revealing nothing. Thane turned to Solara. Your Majesty? Response? High Arbiter, Lord Karvesh cites Chapter 12, Verse 8, but he conveniently ignores Chapter 12, Verse 3. The sovereign holds emergency authority for citizen welfare when assembly action is delayed or denied. I submitted labor protection proposals to the assembly 47 times during my mother's reign. 47 times they were delayed, amended to meaninglessness, or rejected outright. The assembly had decades to address these issues. They chose not to. That constitutes delay and denial, triggering my emergency authority. Karvesh's expression flickered. The Assembly's consideration was not delay, it was deliberation. Deliberation that results in no action for decades is delay by another name, Solara countered. The Common Rights Initiative addresses citizen welfare issues the Assembly has persistently failed to resolve. That's precisely what emergency authority exists for. Thane was silent for a long moment. Interesting interpretation. However, Your Majesty, emergency authority traditionally applies to immediate crises, natural disasters, military threats, plague. Can you demonstrate that labor conditions constitute an emergency? This was the trap. Define emergency too broadly and the precedent could be abused. Too narrowly and the initiative fell. Solara had anticipated this. High Arbiter, I call First Consul Garrett Chen to testify regarding comparative analysis of labor conditions across civilizations and their impact on stability. He'd prepared for this, spent 2 days reviewing data, comparing Velestron labor practices to Earth's history and a dozen other civilizations in the galactic community. But knowing facts and presenting them persuasively under the weight of centuries of Velestron legal tradition were different challenges. He approached the testimony platform. Thane studied him with those ancient eyes. First Consul, you are human. You've been on Velastra for less than a year. What qualifies you to assess our civilization's needs? Exactly that, High Arbiter. I see what you've stopped noticing because it's become normal. Garrett pulled up a holographic display showing comparative data. Across 47 spacefaring civilizations, average working hours range from 35 to 55 hours weekly. Velastra's average is 73 hours. Average minimum wage covers 90 to 130% of living costs across those civilizations. Velastra's minimum covers 62%, forcing workers into debt spirals. Worker protection laws exist in every stable civilization except 3, 2 of which are currently experiencing civil unrest, and the third is Velastra. Karvesh interrupted. Those numbers lack context. Our economy requires... Silence, Lord Karvesh, Thane said sharply. The consul has the floor. The context is this. Civilizations that treat workers as disposable resources create instability. Not immediately, not obviously, but over time, resentment builds. Frustration compounds. And eventually people stop believing the system can serve them. That's not just unfair, it's dangerous. Earth experienced this repeatedly. Labor movements that started peacefully turned violent when systems refused to change. Empires collapsed when they couldn't adapt. The pattern is consistent across every civilization I've studied. He changed the display to show Velestron-specific data. In the past decade, your labor strikes have increased 400%. Productivity has declined 18% despite workers adding more hours. Illness rates in industrial sectors are 30% higher than galactic averages. These aren't abstract statistics. They're symptoms of a system breaking its people. And broken people eventually break their systems. Tan leaned forward. You suggest Velastra faces potential revolution? Adapt now, when adaptation can be controlled and gradual. or resist until the pressure becomes explosive and uncontrollable. The Common Rights Initiative is the former. Reject it, and you risk the latter. High Arbiter, this is manipulation. The human is using fear to justify overreach. Our economy has functioned this way for centuries. Workers understand their role. Sudden changes will create chaos, not stability. Meaning they've accepted powerlessness because they see no alternative. But acceptance isn't stability. It's suppression waiting to ignite. He looked at Karvesh directly. And you know this. That's why you mobilized private forces when the Queen announced her initiative, not because you believed it would cause chaos, but because you feared it would succeed and eliminate your control. The courtroom stirred. Garrett had just accused a High Lord of prioritizing power over empire. In open court, with evidence of military mobilization as proof. Thane struck the harmonic wall again, calling for silence. Lord Karvesh, is the consul's claim accurate? Did you mobilize forces? Defensive preparations? Karvesh said tightly. Standard procedure when political uncertainty. Did you mobilize forces? Yes. Why? Karvesh's mandibles clicked in frustration. Because the Queen's actions created instability. Workers were already organizing rallies. There was potential for violence, or potential for you to lose economic leverage, Garrett said. Workers organizing is only threatening if their demands are just and you've been exploiting them. The initiative doesn't create instability, it reveals existing instability you've been profiting from. You know nothing of our economic realities, Karvesh's composure cracked. You're an outsider, here for months, and you presume to judge centuries of tradition? Our system works because everyone knows their place. Disrupting that serves no one. It serves the millions who can't feed their families despite working 70-hour weeks, Solara interjected. It serves children like Lyra, whose father's wages were cut again despite increased productivity. It serves everyone except the nobles, who've confused their privilege with the Empire's health. Thane raised a hand. Enough. This court isn't a debate stage. He looked at the data Garrett had presented. First Consul, these comparisons are compelling. But they don't directly address the legal question. Does the sovereign have authority to implement these protections without assembly approval? This was the moment. Garrett had one more argument, one more angle that might shift the balance. High Arbiter, may I address the original intent of the Emergency Authority Clause? Chapter 12, Verse 3 was written by Arbiter Kelvin during the Reconstruction era, correct? Correct. Arbiter Kelvin's notes on the clause state, emergency authority exists not merely for sudden catastrophes, but for any condition that left unaddressed threatens the Empire's fundamental integrity. His examples included plague and war, yes, but also systemic injustices that erode citizen faith in governance. Those were his exact words. Garrett had found this 3 days ago, buried in historical archives. It was the foundation of their entire legal strategy. Arbiter Kelvin understood that not all emergencies are sudden. Some are slow-building crises that systems fail to address until too late. He granted sovereigns emergency authority for precisely these situations, when established mechanisms repeatedly fail to resolve fundamental problems. Lord Sedek stood from the observation section. High Arbiter, may I speak? Lord Sedek, you're not a party to this challenge. I understand. But I have relevant perspective. I knew Arbiter Kelvin. I served under him during the Reconstruction. The Consul's interpretation is accurate. Kelvin specifically feared that noble houses would obstruct reforms even when those reforms were necessary. He built emergency authority as a counterweight to institutional inertia. The testimony from one of the most respected nobles carried weight. Garrett saw calculation flashing across other faces. If Sethix was supporting this interpretation, perhaps opposition was more costly than cooperation. Karvesh tried one more time. Even accepting Kelvin's intent, the economic disruption will be less than the disruption of civil war, Sethix interrupted. I fought in the last one, Lord Karvesh. You didn't. You inherited your position and your comfortable certainty that the system serves you. But systems that only serve elites don't last. They collapse. And when they do, no one's privilege survives the chaos. The Queen is offering us controlled change. Reject it, and we get uncontrolled catastrophe. Choose. Garrett saw the moment the balance shifted, saw nobles in the observation section exchange looks, saw calculations change. Thane struck the harmonic wall one final time. This court will recess for deliberation. We will reconvene in 4 hours with our ruling. The chamber emptied slowly. Sylara remained seated, eyes closed, breathing carefully controlled. Garrett sat beside her.
Did we do enough? I don't know. Thany's traditional but honest.
If he believes the law supports us, he'll rule accordingly regardless of political pressure. But 400 years of precedent weigh heavy. We may have lost. Captain Vex brought reports of growing crowds outside the court, thousands of common Velistrands waiting for the decision. The city was holding its breath. 4 hours later, they returned to the chamber. It filled rapidly, nobles and observers cramming every available space. The tension was physical, pressing down like atmospheric weight. Thane entered. His expression revealed nothing. He struck the harmonic wall, and the court fell silent. This case required careful consideration of law, intent, and precedent. House Carvache argues that economic regulation demands assembly approval per established procedure. Her Majesty argues that emergency authority applies when assembly mechanisms fail to address fundamental welfare issues. Both positions have legal merit. Garrett's heart sank. That phrasing suggested compromise, which usually meant the Queen would get partial victory at best. However, Thane continued, this court is bound not merely by procedure but by original intent. Arbiter Kelvin's notes are unambiguous. Emergency authority exists for slow-building crises that established systems fail to address. The Assembly's 47 rejections of labor protection proposals constitute systematic failure. The data presented by First Consul Chen demonstrates clear welfare crisis. Therefore, this court rules that Her Majesty's emergency authority applies. But Thane wasn't finished. That said, unchecked emergency authority threatens the balance our system requires. Therefore, we impose the following condition. The Common Rights Initiative may be implemented immediately, but the Assembly retains authority to modify, not eliminate its provisions after 1 year of operation, based on demonstrated economic impact. This preserves sovereign emergency authority while ensuring Assembly oversight prevents abuse. It was a compromise, but one weighted towards Sylara. She got implementation, the nobles got future modification rights, and the 1 year delay gave the initiative time to prove its value, making modification politically difficult. Carvache stood. High Arbiter, this sets dangerous precedent. Lord Carvache, the ruling stands. This court is adjourned. The harmonic wall rang with finality. Solara stood, and Garrett stood with her. They'd won. Not perfectly, not without future battles, but they'd won. Outside, the crowds erupted in celebration. News spread through the city within minutes. The Common Rights Initiative was law. Change was real, and the Queen, who'd almost died in a coronation chamber, had just proven that transformation was possible. Garrett and Solara made their way through the court, surrounded by Captain Vex's expanded guard. Nobles watched them pass, some with respect, some with hatred, all with the knowledge that the balance of power had shifted. Lord Sedix approached as they neared the exit. Your Majesty, First Consul. That was well done. Dangerous, but well done. Thank you, Lord Sedix, Solara said. Your testimony helped. I spoke truth. That's all. He looked at Garrett. You're making powerful enemies, human. Carvache won't forgive this. Neither will the other hardliners. Watch your back. Always do. Sethix left, and Garrett and Solara stepped into the sunlight. The crowd roared. Garrett saw Lyra in the front, held on her father's shoulders, waving.
He waved back, and the child's face split into a brilliant smile.
We did it, Solara said quietly. First battle won. How many more battles? Garrett asked. Unknown. But each victory makes the next fight easier. We've proven change is possible. Now we prove it works. They returned to the palace, where administrative teams were already mobilizing to implement the initiative. There would be resistance, sabotage, legal challenges at lower levels, but the foundation was laid. That evening, Garrett stood in his quarters, looking out at the city. Lights were blazing in celebration. Somewhere nobles were planning revenge, somewhere workers were daring to hope, and somewhere in the cosmic dark, other civilizations were watching this small drama play out, wondering if transformation could happen without apocalypse. Garrett had knelt to save a queen. He'd stayed to help birth a revolution. And now he was bound to see it through, whatever came next, whatever the cost. A chime sounded. Solara's voice came through his calm. Consul, we have a situation. Carvache has just declared formal separation of House Mordian territories from the throne's direct authority. He's calling it a defensive measure. It's actually rebellion. The celebration outside suddenly felt fragile. Garrett closed his eyes, gathered himself, and activated his calm. I'm coming. The war they'd tried to avoid was beginning. Not with armies yet, but with declarations and positioning. And Garrett realized this was just the opening move in a much longer, more dangerous game. But he'd chosen his side. He'd knelt, pledged, fought. And he'd keep fighting, because sometimes the most profound transformations required the simplest, most difficult choice. To stand when everyone else retreated. To speak when everyone else stayed silent. To believe that better was possible even when the entire weight of tradition said it wasn't. The revolution had survived its first test. Now came the real challenge. Surviving the inevitable counterattack from those who had everything to lose. Garrett headed to the command center, ready for whatever darkness waited in the hours ahead. Karvesh's declaration came with strategic precision. He didn't just announce separation, he coordinated with 3 other houses to simultaneously sever economic ties to the capital. Within hours, supply lines carrying food, industrial materials, and energy resources began redirecting away from Velostra Prime. The message was clear. Support the Queen's reforms, and starve, or capitulate and survive. Solara stood in the command center, watching real-time logistics data paint an increasingly dire picture. They planned this, she said, voice tight with controlled anger. The moment the court ruled against them, they activated contingencies. This wasn't reactive. It was premeditated. How long do we have? The capital has reserves for 30 days at normal consumption, maybe 45 if we implement rationing. After that, she didn't finish. She didn't need to. Captain Vex pulled up military positions. House Karvesh's forces are fortifying the agricultural zones. House Crystalline controls the primary fusion plants. House Mordian holds the main transport nexus. And House Veltec, newly declared against us, controls the water purification facilities for the southern continent. They're not attacking, Garrett said, seeing the pattern. They're sieging. Make life unbearable, blame the Queen's reforms, wait for the people to demand she reverse course. Elegant, Solara admitted. They can claim they're not rebelling, just exercising their traditional rights to manage their territories. Legally ambiguous, politically devastating. Ambassador Threxel entered, his 4 eyes blinking rapidly. Your Majesty, the colonial worlds are requesting guidance. They're prepared to support you, but they lack the resources to supply the capital directly. The noble houses control all major transport infrastructure between here and the colonies. Solara sat at the central console, pulling up empire-wide communications. Then we bypass them. Garrett, you studied Earth's history. When supply lines were cut, how did civilizations respond? Sometimes they found alternative routes. Sometimes they broke sieges with military force. Sometimes they negotiated. He paused. And sometimes they turned scarcity into solidarity, rationed carefully, and proved they could outlast their opponents. Option 4, then. We can't negotiate. It would show weakness and embolden other nobles to try similar tactics. We can't attack. That triggers the civil war we're trying to avoid. Alternative routes would take months to establish. So we endure, we prove resilience, and we turn this siege into a demonstration of the people's commitment to change. Your Majesty, Vex said carefully, asking people to suffer for principles is difficult, especially when they're already struggling. I know. That's why we need to be honest with them. Completely honest. No propaganda, no spin, just truth. Solara activated the empire-wide broadcast system. I'm addressing the entire civilization now. Garrett watched as every screen, every communication device, every public display across Velostron space connected to the palace, billions of faces turned toward their queen. Solara spoke without notes. Citizens of Velostra, you've heard about House Kavesh's declaration. You're seeing supply disruptions begin. You're wondering what this means for your families, your futures, your safety. I'm going to tell you exactly what's happening and what I'm asking of you. She pulled up the logistics data, made it visible to everyone. 4 noble houses have cut supply lines to the capital, and 17 other cities that supported the Common Rights Initiative. This is deliberate economic warfare designed to punish you for demanding fair treatment. They believe if they make you uncomfortable enough, you'll blame me instead of them. They believe you'll choose security over justice. They believe you're too weak to endure hardship for a better future. Garrett saw the genius in her approach. She was framing this as an insult to the people themselves, turning the nobles' strategy against them. I believe differently. I believe you understand that real change requires sacrifice. That transformation isn't comfortable, that sometimes you have to stand in darkness to reach light. So here's what I'm asking. Endure with me. Ration with me. Suffer with me. Not forever, just long enough to prove to these nobles that you can't be starved into submission. Long enough to show them that solidarity is stronger than supply chains. I'm implementing immediate rationing. Food, water, energy, all will be distributed equally. Palace consumption will be identical to civilian consumption. No exceptions. If you go hungry, I go hungry. If you lose power, I lose power. We face this together, or we don't face it at all. The gamble was enormous. Ask too much, and people would turn against her. But frame it correctly, make it shared sacrifice rather than imposed suffering, and it might work. To the colonial worlds, Silara continued. I'm not asking for supplies you can't send. I'm asking for something else. Proof that change is working. Implement the Common Rights Initiative in your territories. Show the Empire what transformation looks like. Let your workers feel the difference, experience the protection, benefit from justice. When the siege breaks, and it will break, I want the entire Empire to see clear evidence that these reforms improve lives, not destroy them. Ambassador Threxel smiled. It was a brilliant move, turned the colonies into living demonstrations while the capital endured. To the military, Silara said. You're watching noble houses coordinate against the throne. You're seeing them weaponize resources meant to sustain the Empire. You're wondering where your loyalty should lie. I won't order you to choose me. But I will remind you that your oath is to Velastra, and Velastra is its people, not the nobles who claim to speak for them. When this ends, ask yourselves, which side defended the Empire and which side held it hostage? The command center fell silent. High-risk strategy, Vex said finally. If the people can't endure, they'll surprise you, Garrett interrupted. People can endure incredible hardship if they believe it matters, if they feel like partners rather than victims, if they see their leaders sharing the burden. Syra just made this about collective resistance instead of top-down imposition. That changes everything. Over the next week, Garrett watched the capital transform. Rationing began immediately, cutting consumption by 40%. Lines formed at distribution centers. Complaints arose, of course. Discomfort was universal. But something else emerged, a sense of shared purpose. Neighbors helped neighbors. Communities organized mutual support networks, and when nobles tried to spread propaganda blaming the Queen, workers countered with simple truth. We're enduring because change is worth this cost. The colonies implemented the Common Rights Initiative rapidly. Within days, reports flooded back, workers experiencing 45-hour weeks for the first time, wages that actually covered living costs, protections from arbitrary dismissal. The contrast with noble-controlled territories was stark. But Karvesh wasn't idle. He broadcast his own message, framed in concern rather than opposition. Her Majesty demands sacrifice while offering only promises. The Common Rights Initiative may sound appealing, but it's destroying our economic foundation. Already productivity in the colonies is declining. Costs are rising. The Empire's stability depends on systems that have worked for centuries. We can negotiate reforms, implement changes gradually, preserve what works while improving what doesn't. This siege ends the moment the Queen acknowledges reality and agrees to reasonable compromise. It was sophisticated. He positioned himself as the reasonable one, the Queen as the stubborn ideologue. Garrett watched public opinion split. Some rallied harder to Silara, others began questioning if compromise wasn't wiser. On the 13th day of the siege, Garrett accompanied Silara to a distribution center in the capital's industrial district. She'd been making daily appearances in different neighborhoods, standing in ration lines with citizens, demonstrating shared sacrifice. Today's visit was to a facility serving the poorest areas. A crowd had gathered. Most were supportive, but tension was evident. A Velistran woman stepped forward, her body language aggressive. Your Majesty, my children are hungry. My husband lost his factory job because his noble employer closed the facility rather than comply with new wage requirements. We supported you, and now we're suffering. When does this get better? Silara didn't deflect. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe another week. Maybe 3. Your husband lost his job because his employer values profit over people. That's not the initiative's fault. It's revealing what was always true about your employer. But I understand your anger. You're right to be angry. This is hard. Harder than I hoped. So what do? Keep suffering while you prove a point? No. You suffer while we build something better. And when you can't suffer anymore, when it becomes truly unbearable, you tell me.
You demand I negotiate. You force compromise.
That's your right. I won't ask more than you can give. But I believe you can give more than Karvesh thinks. I believe you're stronger than he understands. Am I wrong? The woman stared at Solara. The crowd waited. Finally, she spoke. My family can last another week. Maybe 2? After that, I don't know. Then we have 2 weeks to break this siege, or find another solution. I'll take it. Solara looked at the broader crowd. Anyone who can't wait 2 weeks, speak now. I'll negotiate today if that's what you need. Silence. People looked at each other, calculating personal thresholds, wondering if they were the only ones ready to surrender. An old Velestron, the same one who'd knelt in the courtyard weeks ago, spoke up. I can last a month, Your Majesty, if it helps. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to give Solara the mandate to continue. They returned to the palace, and Garrett realized what Solara was doing. She was constantly testing consent, never assuming she had permission to demand sacrifice. It was leadership without coercion, and it was exhausting but powerful. That night, Captain Vex brought urgent news. Your Majesty, we're detecting movement. Military movement. House Karvesh's forces are repositioning. They pulled up tactical displays. Karvesh's troops were shifting from defensive fortifications to something else. Not attacking positions, but mobilization for movement. Where are they going? Solara asked. Unknown. But the pattern suggests they are preparing to escort something. Large-scale transport convoy, maybe? Garrett felt suspicion crystallize. Supply convoy. Karvesh is going to offer relief supplies to the capital, make himself the hero while making you look like the stubborn leader who let her people starve. Perfect political theater, Solara said bitterly. The siege has lasted 2 weeks. People are uncomfortable, but not desperate. He offers relief at exactly the right moment, before suffering becomes unbearable, but while gratitude would be maximal. If I accept, I look weak. If I refuse, I look cruel. So we don't accept or refuse, Garrett said. We beat him to it. We find our own supplies. From where? The colonies can't ship in time. The other noble houses are neutral or hostile. Earth couldn't send resources fast enough, even if diplomatic channels. She stopped. Unless... Garrett saw where her mind was going. The neutral houses. The ones who haven't declared for either side. They have resources, but they're afraid to commit. What if we offered them something Karvesh can't? What do we have that they want? Economic opportunity. The colonies are implementing the initiative, right? New protections, new wage laws. That creates demand for goods and services that noble-controlled territories aren't providing. What if you offered the neutral houses exclusive trade agreements with the colonies, access to markets the colonial worlds are developing? Give them economic incentive to support you that has nothing to do with politics or principle. Solara pulled up house profiles. House Verantis, House Kelmar, House Obsidian, all sitting neutral, all with significant agricultural or industrial capacity. If I offered them colonial trade access, they'd have reason to supply the capital without looking like political supporters. It's just business, and business transcends ideology. Within hours, Solara was in negotiations with the neutral houses. The offers were straightforward. Provide relief supplies to the capital and other besieged cities, receive preferential trade status with the 40 colonial worlds implementing the initiative. The economic potential was substantial. The colonies represented a third of the Empire's population and were beginning to develop independent economic systems now that they had worker protections and rising wages. House Verantis accepted first, then Kelmar, then Obsidian. By the 18th day of the siege, supply convoys from neutral houses were entering the capital. Not enough to end rationing, but enough to ease the worst pressure. Karvesh's own relief convoy arrived on the 19th day. He'd timed it perfectly. Except Solara had already broken his monopoly on being the savior. His supplies were welcome but not critical. His political theater fell flat. The noble sent a private communication requesting a meeting. Solara accepted. They met in a neutral location, a diplomatic facility maintained by the Velestron Council of Worlds. Karvesh arrived with advisors. Solara brought only Garrett. Your Majesty, Karvesh said, his tone courteous but cold. You've maneuvered well. Better than I anticipated. But we both know this stalemate serves no one. Your people are suffering. My territories are losing revenue. The Empire is fracturing. I'm proposing a compromise. I'm listening. Suspend the Common Rights Initiative for 5 years. Allow the Assembly to study its impacts in the colonies. If, after 5 years, the data shows positive results without economic catastrophe, we implement empire-wide with Assembly oversight. In exchange, I lift the economic separation immediately and pledge full support to your throne. 5 years wasn't forever, and it avoided immediate civil war. Garrett watched Solara calculate. No, she said. Carvatia's mandibles clicked. Your Majesty, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. Your offer is a trap. 5 years is long enough for you to undermine the colonial implementations, to create economic problems you can blame on the initiative, to prepare better strategies for resistance. And it sends a message to every worker in the Empire that their rights are negotiable, that if nobles push hard enough, justice gets delayed. No. The initiative stays. Your siege failed. Accept it. Do you understand what that means?
Real war. Not economic pressure, but actual military confrontation.
Thousands will die. The Empire will tear itself apart. All because you won't compromise? All because you won't accept that your unearned power is ending, Solara corrected. You're offering me peace bought with injustice. That's not peace. It's surrender. I won't do it. Carvache stood. Then you've chosen war. Remember that, when the bodies pile up, when the Empire burns, when history judges this moment, you chose. Garrett felt the weight of what had just happened. War, he said quietly. Actual war. Yes. Solara remained seated. I hoped it wouldn't come to this, but Carvache was never going to accept change peacefully. He'd have found another excuse, another crisis, another justification for rebellion. Better to face it now, when we have momentum, when the people still believe, when the colonies are demonstrating that the initiative works. How long until fighting starts? Days. She looked at Garrett. I need you to do something crucial. I need you to contact Earth's diplomatic corps. Tell them what's coming. Ask them to provide humanitarian support, medical supplies, refugee assistance, anything that helps without being military intervention. And ask them to testify to the galactic community that this war was forced on us by nobles unwilling to surrender exploitative power. We need witnesses. We need the truth documented. This was what he'd trained for, in a sense. Representing human interests in alien conflicts, maintaining diplomatic relationships even in chaos. But he'd never imagined doing it from inside the conflict, as a participant rather than observer. He sent the communications. Earth's response came within hours. Humanitarian support approved, diplomatic testimony committed, but no military assistance. Earth wouldn't take sides in Velestron's civil war. It was all Garrett had hoped for, and less than he wanted. On the 23rd day after the court's ruling, Carvace's forces attacked a Crown Guard patrol protecting a supply convoy from neutral House Verantis. 5 guards died, the first blood. Solara mobilized the military. Not all units responded. Some remained loyal to noble commanders, some fragmented into competing factions, some simply refused orders from either side, but enough rallied to the throne to field a credible defense. The civil war Garrett had hoped to avoid had begun, and as he stood in the command center watching tactical displays light up with conflict zones, he understood that everything before this moment had been prologue. The real test of Solara's vision, of his pledge, of whether transformation could survive violence, was just beginning. Captain Vex coordinated defensive positions. We're outnumbered 3-2 in pure military strength, but our forces are more motivated, more unified in purpose. Carvace's coalition is alliance of convenience. If we can break their cohesion, fracture their unity, we might survive this. How do we do that? Garrett asked. By winning quickly and decisively in symbolic locations. By demonstrating that fighting us is costly. By making continued opposition seem futile. Vex pulled up a tactical map. The Kalthara Nexus. It's a major transport hub currently held by House Crystalline forces. If we take it, we cut supply lines to 3 other rebel houses. They'd have to choose between retreating or fighting without support. Casualty estimates? High. Crystalline has fortified heavily. We'd be attacking a prepared position. Then we find another way. Garrett, you said Earth's history had examples of sieges broken through strategy rather than force. What do you know about that? Sometimes attackers didn't attack the position. They attacked the supply lines, the morale, the leadership's will to fight. Sometimes they offered the defenders a way out that preserved dignity. Sometimes they waited for internal fractures to weaken the position from inside. Dignity, Solara repeated. What if we offered House Crystalline soldiers a choice? Surrender with honor, or defend nobles who've already demonstrated they value their privilege over the Empire's welfare? We document Carvace's economic siege, the suffering it caused, the cruelty of weaponizing resources. We show it to every soldier in Crystalline's forces and ask them, is this what you're fighting for? It was information warfare, not military assault. Garrett approved. They might not surrender, but if even a fraction refuse to fight, it weakens their position without costing us lives. Over the next 48 hours, the Queen's forces broadcast documented evidence of the siege directly to House Crystalline's military. Interviews with families who'd gone hungry, data on noble profits versus worker suffering, testimony from colonial worlds showing the initiative's positive impacts. The message was simple. You're fighting to preserve a system that harms most Velostrands for the benefit of a few nobles. Is that worth dying for? The propaganda worked better than expected. Desertion rates in House Crystalline's forces spiked. Not a collapse, but enough to create doubt, enough to fracture their certainty. When Crown forces finally moved on the Kelthara Nexus, they found resistance far weaker than anticipated. House Crystalline's commanders negotiated a withdrawal rather than fight a battle their troops no longer believed in. The Nexus fell without major casualties. It was a symbolic and strategic victory that shifted momentum.
Other rebel houses watched and calculated. House Velthek quietly opened negotiations.
House Mordian began repositioning forces to defensive rather than offensive postures. The coalition Karvash had built was fracturing exactly as Vex predicted, but Karvash himself wasn't done. On the 30th day after the court ruling, his personal forces attacked the colonial world of Theta Velastra, one of the first to implement the Common Rights Initiative. The assault was brutal, designed to send a message: support the Queen, in pay and blood. Solara watched the reports with barely controlled fury. He's targeting civilians. This isn't military strategy, it's terrorism. He wants you to divert forces to protect the colonies. Spread yourself thin.
Make yourself vulnerable.
I know, but I can't let him slaughter people who trusted me. She activated communications to the Colonial Defense Forces. All colonies, fortify, mobilize civilian evacuations, prepare for potential attacks. Crown military will provide support where possible, but your primary responsibility is protecting your populations. Do not engage in offensive operations. It was the only choice, but it strained their forces. Karvash had successfully opened a second front, forcing Sylara to defend everywhere instead of concentrating strength. The war ground on. Weeks became months. Casualties mounted. The Empire's infrastructure strained under the weight of conflict. And through it all, Garrett watched Solara bear the burden of every death, every sacrifice, every cost her vision demanded. He found her one night in her private quarters, staring at casualty reports. Her crystalline skin dimmed almost to gray with exhaustion and grief. "The count is up to 4,000, she said without looking up. 4,000 Velostrands dead because I wouldn't compromise with Karvash, because I believed transformation was worth this cost. Was I right, Garrett? Or am I just another leader who confused principle with stubbornness? You're asking the wrong question. The right question is, would more people have died if you'd surrendered? If you delayed justice another 5 years, another generation, how many workers would have died from preventable industrial accidents, from poverty, from the grinding violence of an exploitative system? Karvash's war is visible. The war against the common people was invisible but just as lethal. You made it visible. You gave them a chance to fight back. That's not stubbornness. That's courage. Courage and 4,000 corpses. Courage and millions given hope. Don't lose sight of what you've built. The colonies are thriving. Workers are organizing. The old system is dying. Yes, it's dying violently. But it's dying, and what comes next might actually be worth the cost. Do you ever regret it? Kneeling in that chamber? You could have stayed an observer, safe, uninvolved. Instead, you're here, complicit in war, hated by half the Empire, bound to a cause that might fail. And I'd do it again every day, because regret doesn't change the choice, and the choice was right. Sometimes the only way to discover what you're capable of is to put yourself in situations where comfortable options don't exist. You did that for me, and I'm grateful, even when I'm terrified. They sat in silence, two leaders from different worlds, bound by a revolution neither had fully chosen, but both had committed to seeing through. The war continued, but slowly, inexorably. The balance shifted. More neutral houses sided with Solara. More rebel forces lost the will to fight. And Karvash found himself increasingly isolated, his coalition reduced to a core of true believers, and those two committed to retreat. The end came not with a final battle, but with a negotiation. House Sathix, who'd remained carefully neutral during the fighting, brokered talks between Solara and the remaining rebel houses. The terms were simple: accept the Common Rights Initiative, maintain your houses and territories, and pledge renewed loyalty to the throne. In exchange, no reprisals, no punishments, no vengeance. Most accepted. The war was too costly, the cause too unclear, the queen too obviously willing to endure any hardship to achieve her vision. They surrendered with dignity intact. Karvesh refused. He retreated to his personal estate and declared it sovereign territory. It was a symbolic last stand, meaningless in practical terms, but important to him. Silera let him have it. One noble and one estate was manageable, and pursuing him further would cost lives for purely symbolic victory. The civil war ended 97 days after it began. 7,838 confirmed dead, tens of thousands wounded. Economic disruption that would take years to repair. But the Common Rights Initiative remained law. The Empire had transformed, and Garrett had survived to see it. The day the peace was formalized, Solara stood before the assembly, now reconstituted with representatives from common workers alongside traditional nobles, and delivered her vision for reconstruction. Garrett stood at her side, first consul of an empire that had been reborn through fire. And when she finished speaking, when the assembly pledged support, when the hard work of actually implementing change across an entire civilization began, Garrett felt something unexpected. Not relief, not triumph, but simple, profound certainty that he'd made the right choice, that kneeling in that chamber had been the most important act of his life, that sometimes transformation required someone willing to ignore the rules, challenge the systems, and bet everything on the possibility that better was achievable. He'd been that someone. And as he looked at Solara, at the crystalline faces of workers and nobles learning to coexist, at an empire taking its first uncertain steps toward justice, he knew he'd do it again. The stars beyond the palace windows blazed eternal and indifferent. But here, on this one world, in this one moment, a human had knelt, and an alien queen had chosen him. And together they'd proven that change, no matter how difficult, was always possible for those brave enough to demand it. The revolution was over. The real work was just beginning. And Garrett Chen, first consul of Velastra, formerly observer and now architect of transformation, was ready.